Good morning and welcome to PAC's Fintech series on financial literacy. I'm Dean Miller, the president and CEO of PAC, and so glad that you decided to join us this morning on a really interesting conversation. As you know, we cover a number of different industry areas. Fintech is one of those that's quite important. We've got some incredible companies, both large and small in this region. And by the way, just as a reminder, you're going to see a bunch of fintech companies also at our Capital Conference coming up on November 16th and 17th. If you haven't registered yet, please go to our website. This morning, we are very grateful for a host of sponsors and supporters, including Baker Tilly, SEI, and Vanguard. Again, great supporters of our community, great supporters of PAC, and certainly the fintech space. As you know, we are in Zoom. You're muted, but you can ask questions. Please use the comments box. We'll monitor it throughout. The panel discussion will go to about 9:35. And then after that, you'll be directed to subject-specific roundtables where you can have a roundtable discussion with one of our experts, one of our panelists participating in that. So we encourage you to stay on for that conversation, which will be about 25 minutes or so. Without further ado, let me introduce our moderator for the discussion this morning, Dax Hill. Dax is the COO of Vanguard Fintech Ventures, among other things, and she'll tell you a little bit more about that. But let me just say this: Vanguard, as you know, a global behemoth in terms of their financial focus, and Dax is specifically focused in a group that's talking about next generation products. So really excited, Dax, to have you here this morning. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dean. And thank you everyone for tuning in. You could be anywhere right now, you're here with us, so thank you for your attendance. As Dean said, my name is Dax Hill, and within Vanguard, we've been innovating since our inception, but we paid special attention to what's happening in fintech. And my group in particular does really interesting experience around what does the next generation of financial needs look like, what are next generation products that will help to accelerate and advance Vanguard's mission. And so it's really an honor to be a part of this conversation with such an illustrious group of speakers. And I don't want to make this about me, I totally want to make this about them. So let's talk about why we're here. And I'm going to give you a little sneak peek into the planning for today's session. So we know we were going to do a series on fintech. And there was a point where we were considering what topics will we bring up, what felt appropriate, and what would resonate with this community, with this audience. Additionally, we wanted to have a conversation that we felt would benefit all listeners, agnostic to their industry, their background, and their life experience. And we came up with several good choices. Now, this is a multi-part series, so I won't spoil it for you, and I won't tell you what we came up with as a full list, but the topic of financial literacy was one of the top three. And why are we starting there? Well, you have to acknowledge that fintech is a complex ecosystem of players. And regardless to whether you're looking at fintech through the lens of retail, institutional, startup, or tech, the foundational truth is it can be really hard to participate in this ecosystem if you're lacking a foundation in financial literacy. And this is exactly why we're here today. So allow me to introduce our panelists. We have Joe, Tanya, and Tina, who are going to go around and say a little bit more about themselves before we start with our first question. Joe, would you like to kick us off?
Hi, thanks, Dax. Yeah, and good morning, everyone. Welcome from the West Coast, bright and early out here. My name's Joe. I'm the founder and chairman of the Financial Fitness Group. My background is in academia and publishing. So very excited about your group, about the topic, and just the concept in general. I used to teach innovation and entrepreneurship at the University of Wisconsin-Madison between grad school and faculty member for about a decade. So between kind of that connection of financial literacy and innovation is an area I'm really passionate about, and excited to share more time with you today.
Excellent, so glad you're here. Tanya?
Good morning, everyone. Tanya Van Court, CEO and founder of Goalsetter. I actually did not come from the financial services space. I formerly led digital products at Nickelodeon and ran marketing for Discovery Education as we were launching digital textbooks into classrooms across the country. So my background is very much in how do you combine education and entertainment and gamification to create digital products that kids and families love. I started Goal Setter, which is a savings, financial education, investing, and smart spending platform created just for kids, because my daughter, who was 8 years old, about to turn 9, said to me, "Mommy, for my 9th birthday, I really only want 2 things." I said, "What's that?" She said, "Enough money to save for an investment account and a bike." And I thought to myself, if I can get every kid in America to say that, I can change the world. And so we are on a quest to work with partners, financial institutions, banks across the country to help them create their next generation of savers and investors. Thank you so much for having me here today. Really excited about this panel.
Absolutely. And so glad to have you with the perspective that you're going to bring. As you said, you're coming outside of the financial services space, but have a lot of wisdom to bear on the topic. And I think it's a really beneficial exercise to think about analogous worlds and how other parts of the ecosystem, the broader ecosystem, might be solving similar problems. So thank you for being here, Tanya. And
thank you, Dax.
Last but certainly not least, let's hear from Tina.
Hi, nice to see everyone this morning. So my name is Tina Hay. I'm the founder of Napkin Finance. What we do is we simplify money and finance using mainly visual elements and assets. So everything from napkins to videos, articles, storyboards, charts, tables. And what we do is we help banks educate their customers. So we work with everyone from JP Morgan Chase to UBS, AARP. We also published a book called Napkin Finance, Build Your Wealth in 30 Seconds or Less, that the New York Times called the best financial primer in years, and now has been translated to numerous languages. But what we're really excited about is getting a lot of people who traditionally are very intimidated and don't engage with finance and understand money, to help them find a more entertaining, engaging way of taking control of their finances. And we deal with people of all ages. We're now in 80 million households across the globe through our partners and distribution channels, and really excited to be here, sharing our perspective on financial literacy, what that means as far as working with large corporations and also directly with consumers.
Fantastic mission. And I think that's what many people need. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but there is a lot of uncertainty, confusion, fear around money management. Anything that we can do to demystify it will maybe make it more approachable, more embraceable for a greater number of people. So really fascinated by the work that you're doing and can't wait to hear more. So with that, let's transition to our very first question. I gave a setup of why we started with financial literacy, and I linked it to the fintech ecosystem, but more broadly and in your own words, starting with Joe and then hearing from Tanya and Tina, why does financial literacy matter to you?
I think at the very basis, you're participating your whole life within the economic system. And if we don't understand the terms and the topics around us, it's hard to play the game in a fair form. I, at the age of 20, had the opportunity to live abroad. I speak Spanish and Portuguese, and it was pretty apparent to me, even though I was fairly fluent in Spanish, that the lack of a few words could result in a really bad haircut, or ending up in the wrong neighborhood or where you're going. And with money, as I was finishing undergrad, worked as a registered investment advisor, I realized that the vast majority of Americans have never been taught basic financial terms. You see the stats, 59% of Americans have basically 59% a score on financial literacy. It literally means people are more likely to tell you the nutritional elements in their special K than the assets they have in their 401k. So I think it's just leveling the playing field. If you understand the language, you now have the capacity to make informed decisions. It doesn't mean everyone is going to be driving their own investments or being the next Peter Lynch, but at least getting people comfortable that they know what questions to ask, to know what tools are right for them or what resources are a good fit.
Absolutely. Speaking the language, understanding the terms in order to be better informed. Completely agree. Tanya, would love to hear your take.
Sure. So Dex, I grew up as a daughter of an elementary school teacher, and she was a teacher for not only her students, but a teacher for her family as well. I skipped kindergarten because my mother taught me everything I needed to know at home. The only thing she didn't teach me was about financial education because she didn't know anything about financial education. And so fast forward, I did well in school. I went to Stanford. I got 2 degrees in engineering. And so a lot of people would say, hey, Tanya's the smart one, right? The people in the family would point at me and say, Tanya's the smart one. Well, when I was 28 years old, I got a job at a Silicon Valley firm. It was a fast growing firm. They gave me a bunch of stock and stock options. And to Joe's good point, no one had ever taught me about stock or stock options or the diversification or asset allocation. So I had no idea what to do with it. So I just left it there. And that worked fine for a while as the stock market was climbing. But then on one fateful day in 2001, the big tech bubble burst. And, we all know that every company on the NASDAQ took a precipitous slide, including the company that I worked for. So my stock, which at the end of the morning was worth, or at the beginning of the morning was worth about $1 million, by the end of the day was worth about $20,000. And for me, that was a very painful lesson that this lack of financial education isn't just something that plagues those who don't get an education or those who aren't privy to education. Every single American is susceptible to not understanding critical financial educational topics and tools for building their own wealth. Fast forward, many years, this led to my quest around closing the wealth gap in America. But I believe that I can't close the wealth gap if I just focus on adults. It really will take focusing on and teaching that next generation, because for adults, as we all know, you're out of time for compound interest, right? If you're 50 years old, there's not much closing of the wealth gap that you can do. But if we teach 8-year-olds and 18-year-olds about how to build their wealth, we have a shot at closing both the knowledge gap and the wealth gap in America. And so that's why I'm so passionate about it, Dax.
I can tell in your delivery that this is something that's very near and dear to your heart. And I can appreciate seeing your portfolio go from one number to a much smaller number, feeling like I feel very helpless in the moment, but this is also a learning opportunity of what to do next time so that I don't feel helpless in the future. So can't wait to hear more about what you're doing at Goalsetter. Tina?
Hi, so the inspiration for the company I started was my own experiences. I started working actually in entertainment, in film, and then I went to business school and found myself sitting with bankers and consultants and found that I was a visual learner, as many people are, and that I understood or was better at understanding topics when I had visual images and graphics and illustrations. And I think the reason that financial literacy I think is important is because many people find it to be not very palatable and difficult to engage with. And what we've tried to do is make it much more simplified and fun and entertaining for people of all ages. But I think the reason it's really important is, we've seen, especially the last few years after COVID, that a few things that, number one, many schools aren't teaching financial literacy or money skills at all. And if your parents don't teach you or you don't learn from your friends, people are, at a big disadvantage. And it becomes a vicious cycle from an early age, taking on debt and making decisions that don't, work well for a long-term financial kind of well-being. But also, I think the importance of financial literacy is that money is important and touches every aspect of our lives. So it's not just your bank account, but your health and your family and your well-being in so many different ways. So it's important to make decisions early on and be equipped with the right skills and understanding of your finances, because again, most people will never learn unless they take some kind of initiative themselves. And again, I think what's really important is finding the right resources and the right tools, which is really actually difficult to do. I think more than ever, there are a lot of opportunities to learn about money and finance and learn financial literacy, but there's also a lot of noise. And so the difficulty is finding the trusted resources that, that are transparent, educational, and then also advocate for the reader and the person instead of for a financial institution.
Thank you so much for that. I just want to say I really appreciate that you intersected financial literacy with cognitive diversity. As someone who is personally neurodivergent, there are times when I've struggled to learn certain concepts, but making it visual made the learning easier. And I appreciate that you recognize that there are people who might have a true barrier to gaining more financial literacy based on the manner of delivery of those lessons. And so taking into account different learning styles, best environment, things you may have been exposed to in your childhood or school career versus not, and figuring out how do we give people exactly what they need? How do we meet people where they are? I love that. That feels like a very human-centered approach to the problem. And I love that you're approaching it and thinking about it from that lens. So in preparation for today's talk, I did a little bit of research, and Joe hit us with a stat, but I'm going to hit us with a few more stats. And these stats come from a 2015 study. It was called the Consumer Financial Health Study. And it was providing a snapshot of the struggle that the typical American household faces. And in that study, it was revealed that 26% of Americans say their finances cause them significant financial stress, and that almost half struggle to keep up with bill payments. About 36% are not confident that they could come up with $2,000 in the next month for an emergency, and that 30% are carrying an unhealthy amount of debt. So I'd like to ask this question to all of you, and I'd like to hear from Tina first. How did I think you alluded to it in your previous answer, but like, how would you explain how we got here to this point in time with these circumstances, with American households feeling and dealing with this type of stress and struggle?
Yeah, so, it's interesting. I think, as I mentioned before, there's so many new opportunities for people to invest. We've seen with retail investing, the rise of Robinhood and a lot of different apps and opportunities to save for retirement and ways to take out the middleman that help people engage with the markets and also empower themselves with their money and finance. But I think the biggest issue right now is, again, the education aspect that's missing early on, and the difference between people who have some kind of education or network or opportunity with their family to learn about money early on, and versus those that don't and make decisions like taking on a lot of debt, student loan debt. And I think the problem has always been there. I think we now just see that there is a chance to, make so many people more empowered and help them make better decisions early on. And I think, I don't think anything has necessarily changed. I just find that there are many more opportunities now for people to help themselves to participate in financial markets, to save for retirement. And if they can find the right resources and get educated and find the right products and services and partners to do that, there's been no better time, I think, than the last few years. I think the struggles that people have are, again, depending on what your background is. I come from an immigrant family. No one ever taught me about investing. And I wish I'd started early on. I think having access to information is probably the biggest factor in people's success ultimately, and leading them down the right path versus, the alternative. And I think there's so many amazing resources and people and companies out there, like we see on the panel, that are helping resolve that.
Yeah. Brilliant point. Access to information is so critical. Joe, what would you add to this thread?
I mean, I think one of the things that just, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with the group, and I love the diversity and the approach. I always joke there's two types of people in the world, those that read instruction manuals and those that don't. And when we think about that for financial literacy, from the time in which our country shifted how we educate, or the importance of being educated, when ERISA was passed and we went from a country where 90% of Americans had a defined benefit plan to one today where less than 10% do, we handed the keys to the car to all us kids who are now adults but we didn't necessarily give them any instruction on how to drive it, right? In the little bit of instruction, there has been over $200 billion spent by retirement plan companies delivering financial literacy or education. But it was sort of the way that if, when we went to college or we went to high school, if they would have just given us the textbook and that was all they did, we could have passed the class. Well, we know that doesn't work, right? So experiential learning in one form or the other, whether it's a traditional structured learning where here's the curriculum, here's the content, and you need to pass these exams, to here's the challenge and here's the goal. And here's how you're going to help people accomplish. So I think that when I think about the challenge we as a nation face, the reality is that we shifted from a country that 90% of us had somebody else managing our money for our retirement to the vast majority of us need to depend predominantly on our own efforts, right? And in that process, how do we shift the learning curve? And you need to reach people of all types, right? So there are people who have traditional instructional learning. They're comfortable reading a tutorial, a course, a curriculum, and that's how they're comfortable. But for every one of them, there's 2 or 3 people who might need to learn in a different way. So
Absolutely. I appreciate your point around book knowledge is not the same as practical knowledge. And I'm old enough to remember when home economics was taught in schools. And for those of you who are a bit younger and don't know what that is, it was a course you would take in either junior high school or high school and would teach you about the economics of running a home. Now, I took the class because you got to make cookies during the school day, not because I cared about how to balance a checkbook, which was also something that they taught. But for me, that was my first real exposure to personal financial management and thinking about my money in a more constructive way, not just allowance that I get from my parents and then I spend on things that I want, but this idea of saving for the future, making really hard choices about sacrificing and paying for things now versus paying for things later, learning about credit. I thought it was a helpful part, but it did not go far enough. Some of the harshest learning lessons I've learned in life have been financial ones, especially around financing my education earlier in life. So as I said, I appreciate your point about sometimes learning through doing is the better teacher than learning through reading.
Yeah, and Dex, just to add that real quick is, I do what I do in part because I also had a home economics course. So less than 5% of people of my generation had a course like you or I had. And ours was experiential. It was pretty cool. You had a life partner. You had to go out and buy a home, buy a car. You had to shop around for investments. And, I remember for me, one of the things that I learned, we didn't do anything on education planning, to your point, which was an area that many of us probably could have and should have had benefit in. But I chose Walmart way back in the late, I think 1989. And my father actually had $10,000 that he had sold a plot of land in northern Minnesota. I told him, he said, where should I invest it? I told him Walmart. Of course, he didn't do it. And, later when we looked at the cost of college, we decided he should have, but that was a different issue. So.
Yeah, sorry that you missed out on that opportunity, but you had a keen eye even back then. And that's the important part.
Yeah.
Tanya, I would love for you to advance the point, but before I give you the question, let me give you some additional stats. So I mentioned the stats around feeling capable of raising $2,000 in the next month for an emergency and some other financial stressors. And these issues tend to cut across age and income and race and ethnicity. But that same study found that Black and Hispanic households of all incomes were struggling more than others. I'll just share 2 of the stats from that subsection of the study, that 19% of Black households and 24% of households that are Hispanic are satisfied with their present financial condition compared to 34% of white households. And that about half of Black and Hispanic households are confident that they can meet their short-term savings goals compared to over 50% of white households. So when you think about financial literacy, who it's for and who's most at risk, what are some things that come to mind and how are you using your company to address the needs of these segments?
Yeah, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I happen to be one of the very few Black women who runs a Fintech company. And I think that that's an important point because when you look at creating products that will reach communities that have been for generations left out of this conversation, if we as a nation are not funding women to lead companies in the fintech space, then we are less likely to have products that speak to moms and speak to the moms who are leading these families. If we are less likely to fund African Americans and Latinos in the fintech space, then we are less likely to have products that are financially educating and engaging those communities. And I think that that is a really important point, because when you look at the state of the overall nation, by 2053, African Americans are projected to have a negative net worth. By 2073, Latinos are projected to have a negative net worth. And there are so many factors that contribute to that. I mean, obviously, lower wages contribute to that. There's a greater responsibility amongst families in the African American and Latino communities to support their extended families for any help that's needed for extended families, emergencies, et cetera. So there are a lot of factors that are weighing in, but certainly one of the factors that's weighing in is this lack of access to both generational wealth and, as I call it, generational knowledge, right? If you've never had money in the community, there is no one to sit down and talk to you about the selections that you're making on your 401k. There's no one to talk to you about life insurance and not only the death benefit of life insurance, but the potential to use life insurance to borrow against, as JCPenney did, and as the founder of Disney World did. They both borrowed against their life insurance in order to start businesses. I mean, these are commonplace knowledge in some other communities, but not so in communities that have never had access to wealth. And so, if we want to see a different America, we're going to have to operate differently as Americans. And one of the things that we really stress is this knowledge for the next generation. And by the way, it's not just the next generation of African Americans and Latinos. If you look at even wealthy families, and I dare say every family who's represented on this panel today, 90% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the third generation. 78% of wealthy families, of wealthy parents, don't trust their kids with an inheritance. The average inheritance is spent within 5 years once people do receive it. And so, even if you come from a space and a place where these conversations could be had, the lack of financial education of adults is having a trickle-down effect to the lack of financial education of their kids. They don't know how to have a conversation about the selections of their 401k because they've never made those selections, right? And to Joe's good point, now there is less than 10% of Americans that have a pension. So we've become a consumer culture, and you can go in almost every house in America and see a flat screen TV. You can see designer sneakers. You can see, a number of other indications of strong consumerism in America. And so we have raised an America of consumers, but we haven't raised an America of savers and investors. We, everywhere you turn, on TikTok, on Instagram, on social media, we are teaching and training Americans about how to be great consumers, what brands they need to know about, what products are the latest products. But we are not doing the same thing on the financial education side. And so I do believe that we had social structures in place, whether it was, a pension as a social structure to take care of people. And in the past 50 years, corporate profits have really taken a lot of those social structures out of the average American's hands. And so now the average American is left without that structure, but also without the knowledge to do for themselves. And that, as you indicated, Dax, particularly applies to African American and Latino families, where I believe we have an even greater responsibility to reverse this curse that I call 2053, because we are truly, as a nation, headed towards economic apartheid. And it won't just impact those communities, it will impact the entire American economy if we have large swaths of our nation who are essentially at a negative net worth.
Absolutely. I'm not familiar with that study in particular, but I saw a similar study that said by 2050, Black net worth will be zero. So I don't know that zero is much better than negative, but both paint the picture of a very dire situation if something isn't done, which I like to actually turn us into a slightly different direction, because I think we've established a case for why we're talking about financial literacy today. There's still more to learn, more to share. I think we cover some of the moral imperatives to acting, perhaps the business imperatives to acting. And at this point, I would love to hear what efforts, they could be efforts from government or the private sector or public sector. What efforts do you see to implement strong financial solutions for this next generation are standing out to you? But it could be solutions that you're developing within your own companies or things that you've come across in the ecosystem. We'd love to hear, what should we be paying attention to? And maybe we can start with Joe and then hear from Tina and then from Tanya.
Yeah, so I'm going to try my best to be succinct because I got a lot of thoughts on this topic. And the good thing is they're mostly good. Government has its challenges, no question about it, but an area that has become a little less partisan has been this understanding of the importance of financial education and empowering people. At the federal level, we've certainly seen, certain new agencies, certain groups that are out there and pushing and promoting activity. But where I think you see the greatest change is on the state level. And so for our youth, and it's not what it should be, but it's far greater than it had been. There's been, I think it's around, and I don't know the exact number, but it's somewhere near 20 to 30 states have now passed mandates requiring financial literacy in different degrees for children. And that's a huge step forward. They're not all the mandate that maybe we could or should or would want, but it's a great step forward. The other thing that I see is that many of us, I think, understand that every state government has a obligation to regulate financial service firms, but also educate them. And I've had the pleasure to work with different state agencies, 16 in total, to promote financial literacy. And there is some tremendous innovation. I mean, the challenge at a state government level, when it looks at regulation, if you look at any state, if you have 500 people working to regulate financial service firms, you might have one person to educate them, right? To educate all of your citizens. That said, there is a huge amount of innovation. So the one quick thing I did want to mention that we've been working on of late, we've been involved in about $10 million in grant funded projects funded by state governments that are trying to make and measure an impact. And while $10 million is a reasonable amount of money, we're talking about 330 million consumers, right? So that's not even a fraction of a cent per person to try to impact or influence change. So some of the more innovative thinking I've seen is the role of government in a public-private cooperative and how you can really make a difference. So in the state of Wisconsin, I'm originally from Wisconsin, I live in California. They were the first state to create an office for financial literacy. And the office is funded with a single person, but just creating an office and then a governor's task force has allowed the individual who runs it to assemble a team of people who care, right? And it's pretty amazing at the sense the governor's task force has started a program called Elevate Wisconsin, which is focusing on recognizing the CEOs of companies for what they're doing to make an impact on the financial wellness of the workforce. I think in the youth market, the same thing can and should be done. But that idea of how government can really inspire or create change. I don't think we're there yet, for DEI. We've seen some of the challenges to the CEOs to take a pledge to make an impact, to create more diversity, equity, inclusion in their companies. But you can start to feel the ripples. I've been around doing this sort of work for a while, and I've seen that sort of work make a big difference. So I think government can be a catalyst. I don't think we're ever going to tax and spend our way into financial security, for people. I think ultimately you do need to look at how government can actually challenge good behavior. Final thing I'll say, and this isn't government related, but if you look at other trends where we've made a positive impact, think about, for those of us who are over 40, how many people you knew you smoked 20 years ago, and compare that to today, right? So the reality is behavioral science and that wasn't a government mandate, government supported it, but ultimately what happened was a public-private cooperative of looking at what works to change people's behavior. And what works is getting people, for smoking in particular, is getting people in the ecosystem and where they live. And oftentimes that is the workplace. It's also the public education system. But those are kind of the peers within whom we look to. It's not only what we know, but we look around at what others are doing. And smoking is much less favorable today than it was 20 years ago. And I hope that we'll see that future for financial wellness as well, where saving becomes a lot more cool than spending, right? And where we don't just judge the affluence based on the TV you have on the wall or the clothes you're wearing, but on what you're doing to help invest and save for the future of yourself and your kids.
Really great points. Gina, your thoughts?
So I think I agree with everything that Joe said, and I think what we find is, we're a financial literacy platform, education platform, but what we find is a couple of things. Number one, that we find a lot of challenges working with schools, and working with students. And the way that we do that, we're a mission-driven company, so we from day one we've been providing our content pro bono to a lot of nonprofits, universities, and other education focused partners. But the challenge has been also, how do you deliver the content? I mean, who's teaching the content to students, and the quality of the content. And so a couple challenges we've had is that, we see that schools who would like to deliver the content, there is a lot of trouble getting to students, even if they do have access to the resources. The second is finding the right people who are willing to pay for it. So parents are traditionally willing to pay for it, pay for content and pay for ways to educate their kids. And we've seen a lot of initiatives recently with, with mandating financial education in classrooms. But again, from what we've experienced, is a lot of the content that's being delivered is actually not very high quality, or something that you can actually get kids to engage with. So what's the challenge is finding ways to not only reach students, but find content that they actually want to engage with. And so I think those are the two big challenges that we've come across. Again, it's, we speak to so many parents who ask us why we're not in schools or in classrooms, and we found so many challenges in getting our content to students that, it almost makes it not worth our time to pursue that path, which I find actually really, it's very disappointing, because that's actually our ultimate goal, is to educate this next generation. But we're hoping that we find, unique ways of targeting and finding people who actually need the content, and getting it to them in a way that's not packaged in some kind of marketing for a financial institution. So there's no call to action of learn about, how to invest, but now you have to open up an account. It's education for the sake of education. And I think that's also really hard to deliver these days, when a lot of people are getting their information from YouTube, where, there is a product or service kind of tied to the content and the experience.
Absolutely. I thought of my son when you mentioned YouTube. My son uses YouTube and TikTok to teach him how to live. And he's even started looking at these financial advice videos. And I had to remind him that not all content is good content. Not all content is vetted content. And he's a young person, he's 16. So he may not be as discriminating as someone in their 40s watching the same material. But to your point, there's something around really thoughtful content creation where it's fact-based, it's fact-checked, and the delivery mechanism can reach people where they can be found, whether that's on social or in real life. Tanya, what are your thoughts?
I just want to pick up on that thread, because I couldn't agree more. It's really interesting when we create content and we put it in front of kids. What we typically hear from kids is, wow, I have a business class at school and I don't understand anything that they're talking about, but I just watched your video and I really get it, and it's really fun and funny. And then what we hear from their parents is, wow, my kid just came home talking about the rule of 72 because they watched your video. I don't know what the rule of 72 is. Can I use your tools too? And so we have really started to create family-based content that, there are so many of us who watch, right? We watch family shows that appeal to the whole family. And so our lens and perspective coming from Nickelodeon was, if Nickelodeon can make family shows that do appeal to the whole family, and, other networks can do so too. I don't know who's a fan of Blackish out there or Grownish, but those are certainly shows that, my 6-year-old watches and my 16-year-old watches and I enjoy. And so there is this notion of family television. Why can't we make family finance? And so we have really created videos that are engaging and exciting to the whole family, but also covering those core educational principles that if you walk up to the average person in New York City, they would not be able to explain. What is the rule of 72? What's the difference between a stock and a bond? Explain to me compound interest versus simple interest, right? They wouldn't be able to explain those, but now they can. And so when you ask what efforts, there are a couple of efforts that we're engaging in right now. One is to the point of fishing where the fish are and meeting people where they are. We are launching programs in school systems and with cities across the nation. So we just recently launched the Birmingham Financial Freedom Project. In the Birmingham project, we are not only providing financial education and savings and investing tools to the students, we're also providing them to the teachers and to the parents as well, because we know that teachers and parents have been left out of the conversation and they need to be invited into the conversation. Otherwise, they won't be able to create the appropriate context for their kids at home. And so that's really important. But the second thing that we're doing is we're partnering with banks and wealth managers and financial institutions to provide this next generation of financial education and financial education tools to their users and their customers. And the reason it's so important for them is, listen, I came from the cable industry. I saw the disintermediation of an entire industry, not at the hands of adults with Netflix, at the hands of kids with Netflix. It was kids who were coming out of their parents' houses who said, I'm not paying $200 a month for a cable subscription. I'll just stick with my Netflix, stick with my Amazon. And the same exact thing is going to happen in the banking and financial space. If the next generation is not built as a new set of customers where you are engaging your current customers to reach that next generation of customers, in 18 years, every financial institution is going to wake up and say, wait a minute, what happened to that next generation of customers? Well, guess what? You weren't even in their consideration set because they didn't have a relationship with you. They didn't know about their parents' relationship with you. And so it really is about how do you reach this next generation through their parents and help them to grow up financially savvy so that they're choosing the right kinds of products and services and not just choosing, quite frankly, to be on Cash App or, to be on Robinhood. They are choosing these other alternatives because these other alternatives are the only ones that are in their consideration set. And if they're going to know about responsible financial products, they have to be introduced to them early when they are starting to seek out this kind of information and have these kinds of conversations.
I couldn't agree more. We've covered so many vectors into solving this problem. I just want to play it back for the audience and then follow up with the question. We talked about tools and solutions that include public and private cooperatives, new federal agencies being created, initiatives at the state level, as well as financial literacy organizations in schools, rollouts in large cities and other communities. We talked about thoughtful content creation. We talked about content delivery, and this idea of we are designing not just for an individual, but in some cases we're designing for whole families. For all of these wonderful efforts, the natural question is, but how do we know if it works? How do you measure impact in this space relative to all these very different solutions that do not feel apple to apple, but very much apple to giraffe? So we'd love to hear your thoughts. We're just gonna do whoever wants to jump in first, because I've been calling names, but whoever feels compelled to speak first, feel free to jump in.
I'll jump in and I'll just go quickly. I hate the financial solutions that measure impact by saying we were in front of this many customers. That means nothing to me. And I think it's a cop-out, and I think it's the way that they've been monetizing their solutions without being accountable for delivering results. And so two things, right? Number one, I think you have to make sure that you are creating engagement moments that we are requiring in some instances. So with Goal Setter as an example, our teen and tween debit card comes with a rule called learn before you burn. Your teen's debit card will automatically freeze on Sunday morning if they haven't taken their financial literacy quiz for the week yet. And the minute they take that quiz, the card will unfreeze again. So one, you have to, require that they actually engage with the content, not just say that you provided the content. Then the second is there actually has to be some pre-test and post-test. You have to be able to measure aptitude increase, or you have to be able to measure some behavioral difference. We launched Goal Setter in a classroom of ninth graders in Brooklyn, New York, and these were mostly disadvantaged ninth graders. Within an 8-week period, their financial aptitude increased by 33% in only 8 weeks, and with no teacher intervention. This was them using a tool, and we're measuring those things because we want to hold ourselves accountable. If what we're doing isn't working, then we need to be doing something else. So I think it's very important for measurements to take place around two areas. One is either aptitude increase, or behavioral difference. Are you saving more? Are you investing more? Is there a real outcome associated with our efforts?
Thank you. Joe, looks like you're going to jump in.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'd love to build on that. And I can't encourage people to think through that as much as, what gets measured gets done. And I 100% agree that we had 30 years where the nation was spending billions of dollars distributing newsletters and enrollment kits to 401k plan participants that people don't read and that end up in the trash. That's not education. Education is, the word educate means to draw out of oneself, right? And it actually needs to be measured by what outcomes are you generating. And I think there are leading indicators, and then there are the goals that we as a nation are setting, right? The leading indicators, which need about our medium, digital medium, the medium that Tanya and Tina and I and many of us interact in, is you get metrics, you get a lot of understanding. So you can look at your average user who comes in, how much time are they spending on your content? And how does that compare to other things? Like on our Bank of America Merrill Edge site, the average user spends over 15 minutes. It's 5 times more than they spend on any other part of their website. Right, so people are actually engaged, but that's not enough. You need the measures of, can you actually change knowledge? Can you measure the impact of behavior change? So I think it's really, really important. One quick thing, and just to understand that the nation as a whole, for a long time, people wanted personal finance literacy. It's always the number 1, number 2, or number 3 best-selling book. Personal finance has been a top-selling category for over 30 years. The difference with the other 2 top-selling categories, romance and self-help, people buy romance books and read them. People buy personal finance books with the intent to read them, right? And so it's that measuring and getting people to act on their own good intentions that the digital medium allows. Looking at, okay, how much did you take a quiz question a day? Can you improve your knowledge in a particular area? Can you create a score? So for those of you who are fintechs or financial service firms, look for the way that you're measuring an outcome. Right? And what are the outcomes you want? Ultimately, I think, as Tanya mentioned, you can look at behavior changes. We did a 2.5-year research study with 80 companies where we did a control and sample, and we moved 4,000 people through a financial fitness score. Half of them went through content, half of them did not. The other half, everyone took the score again, and then they went through content. And basically, we saw that there was about 4,000 people, 100 who didn't do the content, 3,000 some who did. People who went through the content saved on average 40% more, right? So it is possible. It's hard to measure, but it is possible to the people to change a behavior. And the cool thing about finance versus, like, if you look at the wellness world, getting somebody to quit smoking is a really difficult thing to do, especially when everyone was smoking around you, and you could have a drink and it's really easy to fall off the wagon. Getting people to put their savings on autopilot and keep it there and spend a little less than they make, it is not simple, but there's a lot of parts of saving and money that are simpler than just the personal discipline of diet or other self-help efforts. And so those are things that I think we should realize it is an achievable goal, but you have to measure the outcomes.
Thank you.
I can just quickly add to that. I mean, we work with a lot of large banks, and so it's very interesting for us to see how they measure the content. It's not necessarily in the interest of the user, it's with engagement with products and services. But what we've done internally with our content is try to measure the impact, and it's almost impossible because you almost have to measure over a lifetime how people make decisions as they go through different milestones. So the impact of financial literacy is when someone is taking out a loan, is when they make big purchases, how they invest, how they make a lot of decisions that are related to different stages in their lifetime. And that's how people engage with financial education, usually outside of school, is people look for resources when they're making a big decision quite often, like, getting married or having children. And so in some ways, it's been almost impossible for us to create, a way of understanding exactly how financial education is impacting people's lives, and doing that accurately. But I think there are ways or ways to find patterns in groups and people that we interact with, of how they're engaging with their money differently after engaging with napkin finance content and based on the decisions that they're making. But again, just to understand how financial education impacts, as a certain reader is really almost impossible for us in a lot of ways. And so we think about it all the time, how to measure that. But yeah, so we find it's very interesting, and we're always thinking about new ways of understanding how our education and our content impacts the reader and ultimately changes their behavior for the better.
Thank you. Joe, Tina, and Tanya, I can't believe we're almost at time. We have 7 minutes left, time for one more question, but let me just play back what I heard about dimensions for measuring impact, that there are a couple of ways that we can approach it. Some ways that we have been shown to work is measuring behavioral difference. What were the set of behaviors before the intervention, and how have those behaviors improved or declined after the intervention? You could also measure it by aptitude increase. Simultaneously, that there are measurements that might be leading, that are very obvious, like how much time people are spending with content online versus lagging, what comes to mind there is more around goal attainment. Did you actually hit your 20-year goal of retiring at 45 or not? And then the last part, which is probably at the intersection of all these things, is the metrics are entangled with life stage. So depending on if you're a student or a young professional or newly married or a new parent, what you're measuring would be dependent on where you are in your stage of life, which all suggests to me that this is a really complex conversation, and the metrics can get very complex as well, but we have really smart, brilliant people like all of you working on these problems for us. So thank you. I'm here to my last question before we jump into our breakout rooms, and that is, I would like to go back to behavior. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the Transtheoretical model of change, but basically it's a framework that talks about how to get people to break habits or form new ones. And at the earliest stages, there's this stage called pre-contemplation, where you really don't even realize that there's a problem. But once you discover that there is a problem, now you're at stage 2, which is contemplation. You recognize that something could be better in your life, but you're not really sure how to go about it. And then once you get that information, and I'm super simplifying this framework, but I think the point still remains. At the point that you act, that there are things that can lower the barriers to acting, help people overcome that inertia. And so that's my final question for you. What are you doing to get people engaged, to help people to act and overcome barriers or inertia to doing something today? And maybe we can start with Tanya.
You're on mute, Tanya.
I don't know how that happened. Sorry. I think the main thing that we're doing is we're taking away the shame and we're taking away the judgment. So many people feel like they are the only ones who do not understand financial concepts. And so when they are approached with, having to understand more about their 401k or about their investments, they feel bad about themselves, and they almost feel in many ways incapable. And daunted by, reading the scores and scores of information that are on financial websites that are over their heads, or maybe that are not presented to them in a way that they can connect with. And we are taking away that barrier, which is, hey, you don't have to be a PhD from Harvard to understand key financial topics that you need to know in order to live a financially healthy and a successful life. And so we're going to help you to do that. And we're going to help you to do that in a fun way, in an engaging way, in a way that invites you in and makes you feel a part of something, instead of a way that, really leaves most people out and makes them feel like they are not capable of understanding this body of knowledge. And so, I think that's the primary thing that we're doing. We're inviting them in a way that is engaging and removing all of the shame that they have around, this is just me, or this is a body of knowledge that I can't learn.
Yeah. So I like the acknowledgement that sometimes the barrier could be ourselves and self-inflicted, our own personal feelings about our lack of acumen that leads us to choose silence, or leads us to not engage with the material because we're dealing with feelings of doubt, shame, and judgment, as you mentioned. And that you don't have to be a PhD from Harvard to know this stuff. It's actually quite easy to follow if simplified in the right way. So thank you for that, Tanya. Joe, how do we get people to overcome their barriers?
First of all, I love the question, Dax, and I love that you're pushing us to think through that. I've had a little bit of pleasure to get to know some of the models of change, like Prashaka's models for change, et cetera. And change often starts with intent, right? So long before you actually do something, you have the intent to do it. Harder to measure intent, but it can be done through simple surveys. I do think a journey of 1,000 miles always starts with a single step. So whenever we're working on a program, whether it's in the workplace, which we've worked with thousands of companies, or it's with youth, we work with Indian nations, you always try to figure out, how do you get momentum to work for you versus against you? My kids and I, my grandfather tried to teach us the concept of inertia, and we thought it was just a funny word. But the reality is inertia is either going to work for you or against you. A body in motion stays in motion, a body at rest stays at rest, right? And when it comes to change, it's how do you get people to take action on their intent in a simple and small way that gives them confidence to move to the next. It's going to be different whether you're dealing with adults in the workplace, on a website, or for consumers. But that concept is what we always have to ask, is how do you get somebody enough confidence that the pleasure of doing something positive starts to outweigh the pleasure of doing nothing at all? So.
Wonderful add-on. Brings to mind a book. I don't know if we could do name drops, but Atomic Habits is all about that, like thinking about the future version of yourself, leaning into the mindset. Eventually the practices follow, giving yourself like ways to build momentum. And then, as you said, starting with a single step. So thank you for those very good reminders. And now, Tina, you get to close out this question and close out the formal part of our workshop before we jump into the break rooms. What would you like to add?
Yeah, so I mean, I think everything that Tanya and Joe said makes so much sense. I think what we've seen is the big thing, I think, right now for a lot of people that we talk to is trust, is that who do you trust to give you the right information and because a lot of people are looking for products and services, but what's happened is, there is, if they don't have a financial advisor or someone who's giving them helping them with information, a lot of people become stuck and don't take any action. And so we've seen this, for example, I'll give you one example. Is a friend of mine who at one point wanted to invest some money for her daughter and asked me what I think they should do. We don't give any financial advice. I said maybe to open up a Vanguard account and just, she can open up a self-directed account. It's very simple. And she said, how do I even open up a Vanguard account? But the example I'm giving is that even something as basic as opening up an account, some people really need help with. Also, who they can trust for information is another big issue that we've found, is that there is a disconnect. People are getting financial information oftentimes from banks or from financial institutions, but people are not necessarily trusting the information. And so they're not taking action. And then the other aspect of it is that it's a very financial products can be very confusing. We have a 401k, and even with my background and my education and now working within financial education, I still have trouble understanding and knowing definitely, you know, the right account to open and how what we should be the next steps to take and how to manage the account. There's so many things involved that I understand how confusing it can be to really understand not only your finances, but also your entire financial picture. So it's not just about investing. It's about understanding how to build your credit. It's about understanding how, you know, what kind of insurance you should have, how you should plan for retirement, how you should save for your kids' education. Finance is so complicated and there's so many different aspects. And so it's understandable why it's really hard for people, unless you have a really trusted resource or person who's guiding you, can be very confusing for most people.
Mm-hmm. What a wonderful note to end on, because I think people, while listening to this conversation, maybe see themselves. I think all of us would admit that finances can be intimidating and scary, depending on the context, and that there's just so much to understand. But who doesn't want someone trustworthy in their corner, helping to guide them in the right direction? Whether that's someone who is more of a DIY person, to Joe's point, give them the textbook, they're going to read it front to back and they're going to figure it out. Or someone more like Dex is like, hey, I'm going to read that textbook, but I still want you to hold my hand part of the way because I'm nervous and I don't want to make any mistakes that will haunt me for a long time. And just recognizing that there are people on both sides of that spectrum, and we need to be able to support people wherever they are in that journey. Tina, Tanya, and Joe, this has been so fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us today. And to the audience, thank you for tuning in and staying for the entirety of the presentation. At this time, we're going to move each of you into breakout rooms, and we have 3 of them. So Tina is going to be leading a conversation around the top financial areas to master. Joe will be in a different room discussing how to drive engagement and measure impact. And Tanya will be discussing building generational wealth and building generational customers. So hope that you stay around for the breakout rooms, get a chance to engage with the speakers, some of the other attendees today, and just get the fullness of the program. So thank you again for being here. I'm Dax Hill of Vanguard, and I hope to see you all in person one day soon. Thank you.